Long before economists gave inflation a name, long before charts, price indexes, or monetary policy committees, Rome discovered something most societies only learn when it is too late. Money is not just a tool of exchange, it is a social agreement. And when that agreement weakens, everything built on top of it begins to erode. The Roman Empire did not collapse overnight. It did not fall because of a single invasion, a single emperor, or a single bad decision. It unraveled slowly, quietly, through a series of choices that seemed reasonable at the time. Choices made to preserve stability, fund security, and maintain the appearance of control. And at the center of those choices was inflation. Not inflation as a headline number or a temporary spike in prices, but inflation as a structural process, a gradual dilution of value, a slow breakdown of trust, a transformation of money from a stable foundation into a political instrument. Rome's fall was not caused by inflation alone, but inflation was the mechanism that weakened every other pillar of the empire. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what Roman money represented at its peak. At its height, Rome's currency was trusted across continents. A Roman silver coin could move through markets in Gaul, Egypt, Asia Minor, and beyond. It paid soldiers, it settled debts, it stored value, and it worked because it contained real silver. The value of money was not abstract, it was physical, measurable, verifiable. This trust allowed Rome to build something extraordinary, a vast interconnected economy supported by trade routes, standardized taxation, and predictable exchange. The empire's roads and ports were not just military assets, they were economic arteries. Goods moved, labor specialized, cities grew, and money tied it all together. But empires, by their nature, are expensive. Rome maintained massive standing armies across distant frontiers. It funded public works, grain distributions, bureaucracies, and increasingly elaborate court life. Early on, conquest paid for these costs. New territory brought new resources. Spoils of war flowed into the treasury. Taxes expanded alongside borders. Growth funded growth. Eventually, that model broke down. Expansion slowed. Borders stabilized. The easy gains disappeared. But the expenses remained. Armies still needed pay. Cities still needed food. Administrations still demanded funding. Rome reached a familiar historical moment. The point where obligations grew faster than productive capacity. At that point, there were only a few options. The state could reduce spending. That risked military weakness and political instability. It could raise taxes. That risked rebellion and economic contraction. Or it could alter the money itself. Rome chose the path that felt least painful in the short term. Rather than openly extracting more from its citizens, Roman authorities began reducing the silver content of their coins. At first, the change was small, barely noticeable, a slight mixture of copper, a marginal reduction in purity. The coin looked the same, it carried the same stamp, it was declared equal in value to older coins. On paper, nothing had changed. In reality, everything had. By debasing its currency, Rome could mint more coins from the same amount of silver. This allowed the state to meet its obligations without raising taxes or cutting spending. Soldiers were paid, suppliers were compensated. The system continued to function. For a time, it even appeared successful. But money does not operate on decree alone. It operates on belief. Merchants began to notice the difference. They weighed coins. They compared older issues to newer ones. They adjusted prices accordingly. What once cost one coin now required two. Not because merchants were suddenly greedy, but because the money itself had changed. This was the beginning of inflation. As prices rose, wages followed. Soldiers demanded higher pay to maintain their standard of living. The state responded by minting even more debased currency. Each cycle reinforced the next. More money chased the same amount of goods. Trust weakened further. Prices climbed again. The empire was caught in a feedback loop of its own making. Over time, the silver content of Roman coins collapsed dramatically. What had once been nearly pure silver became mostly base metal, thinly coated to preserve appearances. The illusion held briefly. But illusions depend on ignorance, and ignorance does not last in markets. As confidence in money declined, behavior changed. People stopped saving. They spent quickly before value eroded further. Long-term planning gave way to short-term survival. Contracts became harder to enforce. Trade slowed. The economy became less efficient, less interconnected, less resilient. In response, the state tightened control. Price ceilings were imposed. Merchants were ordered to sell at fixed rates. This did not restore affordability. It drove goods off the market. Shortages followed. Black markets flourished. Enforcement expanded. Coercion replaced cooperation. At the same time, taxation increased. As inflation reduced the real value of tax revenue, the state demanded more. Farmers were assessed higher obligations. Small landowners struggled to comply. Many failed. Their land was absorbed by large estates controlled by elites with political connections. Economic power concentrated upward. To survive, ordinary Romans increasingly tied themselves to powerful patrons in exchange for protection. Independence declined. Mobility collapsed. The economy became rigid and stratified. What later generations would recognize as feudal relationships began to take shape, not because Rome intended them, but because inflation made economic freedom unsustainable. Cities suffered most. Urban centers depend on stable trade, predictable prices, and functioning monetary systems. As inflation undermined commerce, cities hollowed out. Infrastructure decayed. Public services deteriorated. Skilled labor dispersed. The empire became more rural, more localized, more fragmented. Meanwhile, the military weakened. An army depends on logistics, pay, and loyalty. Inflation disrupted all three. Supplies became harder to procure. Pay lost purchasing power. Soldiers grew dissatisfied. Rome increasingly relied on mercenaries whose allegiance was tied to payment rather than identity. Loyalty shifted from the state to the highest bidder. This vulnerability did not go unnoticed. External pressures mounted. Invasions became more frequent. But the invasions did not cause collapse. They exploited it. Rome was no longer economically strong enough to respond effectively. The empire still existed administratively, but its capacity to project power had eroded. What makes this process so important is that none of it required malicious intent. Roman leaders were not trying to destroy their economy. They were trying to preserve it. Each decision made sense in isolation. Each response addressed an immediate problem. It was the accumulation of short-term solutions that created long-term ruin. Inflation did not announce itself as a threat. It presented itself as relief. And that is why it is so dangerous. By the time Roman authorities attempted reforms, trust was gone. Once trust disappears, money ceases to function. No decree can restore belief. No enforcement can substitute confidence. The economy had already shifted into survival mode. The political collapse that followed was not sudden. It was the final stage of a process that had begun centuries earlier. Rome did not fall because it was invaded. It was invaded because it was economically hollowed out. Inflation did not topple buildings or breach walls. It weakened incentives. It distorted behavior. It undermined cooperation. It transformed a productive system into an extractive one. And when that transformation was complete, collapse was inevitable. Rome's story is not unique. It is a pattern. Empires expand, obligations grow, resources strain, money is manipulated to bridge the gap, inflation spreads, trust erodes, economic behavior changes, power concentrates, social cohesion weakens, collapse follows, the names change, the technologies improve, the logic remains. Inflation is not just an economic phenomenon, it is a social one. It redistributes power quietly, it punishes savers, it rewards proximity to authority, it accelerates inequality, and over time, it fractures the agreements that hold complex societies together. Rome learned this the hard way. The lesson is not that inflation always causes immediate collapse. It is that inflation changes systems before it destroys them. By the time the damage is visible, the foundations are already compromised. History does not repeat because leaders fail to read it. It repeats because incentives remain consistent. Rome believed it could manage decline without consequence. Many societies believe the same. They are usually wrong. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.